We just have a few questions. So Jonathan has asked, fruit is full of sugar. Why are we told constantly not to eat it?
Yes, there is sugar in fruit, naturally occurring sugars, but the way it's packaged with fiber and with all the phytonutrients, so the nutrients that come with plants, the polyphenols and all these other things, the impact, okay, we got to talk about the impact of fruit on your blood glucose in a couple of contexts. If you have type 2 diabetes, a lot of people are told you can't eat fruit. Now, what I was just mentioning there, the way in which the sugar is packaged in fruit is not going to impact your blood glucose level to the same degree that, say, a Mars bar is, right? So if you have 30 grams of sugar in a Mars bar or a chocolate bar or whatever, or candy or ultra-processed food compared to 30 grams of sugar in a fruit, very different impact on your blood glucose level. The fruit is likely going to have a slower increase into your bloodstream. The glucose will enter slower. It won't peak as high and it'll come back down, right? While something like a Mars bar or, I don't know, jelly beans is going to enter very quickly. And in some cases, it will take a while to come back down, right? So fruit is very healthy. It's actually associated with less type 2 diabetes. If you look at the literature of fruit intake and rates of diabetes, people who eat more fruit have less incidence of type 2 diabetes. Now, if you have type 1 diabetes, it just comes down to your glucose tolerance. So for me, it might mean that I need 2 units to eat, a bowl of fruit or a couple of apples, and someone else might need 3 units or 1 unit. So it depends on your carbohydrate to insulin ratio. But generally speaking, you definitely don't have to fear fruit. If people are telling you not to eat it, tell them to ask them why they think you shouldn't eat fruit, and then we can talk about that. Yeah,
it's like the orange juice, the fresh orange,
right?
Kind of, the way you address that would be like, they've extracted all the goodness, all the flesh, all the skin. Right. It's just the juice, so it's just the sugar without the fiber. But if you have the flesh of the fresh fruit, it's kind of same thing with grapes, sultanas, when they dehydrate it. And even then, it's not just how the glycemic index of the fruit changes, but also the quantity. If you have a full bowl of grapes and you dehydrate them down, it's probably one hand. How many times when you're in primary school did you open a pack of sultanas and just go down the hatch in one go? And then, that's like a whole bowl of grapes. So
exactly. So you got to look at the volume of the food and how much carbohydrate or calories are in that. So if it's a very, very high volume food that's low energy density, you have a license to go for it, right? So like if the example is try to eat 10 apples, right? I'm pretty sure that you are going to be bloated and full after maybe 3, and it's very hard to overeat apples. Yeah. But like similar to your example, dried apples, you could probably eat 10 dried apples in a minute, So yeah,
smash the juice in.
Right, exact same. Yeah. So don't fear fruit. Fruit's amazing. Probably, but you know what? People probably need to eat more fruit, if anything. Yeah. I think that's the last thing that we need to be avoiding. It's fruit and vegetables. Most people can increase in their diet. You don't have to be avoiding it.
And Robin has said, first thing after waking in the morning, why are my blood glucose levels high?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. So it depends on what condition you have, but generally speaking, let's say you have type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance and you wake up with a high fasting blood glucose, it's an indication that overnight your liver was putting glucose in your bloodstream, right? So our livers have like this glucose tap, so to speak. The tap was on overnight, which means glucose is entering the bloodstream. Your insulin should, if your pancreas is working properly, your pancreas should produce insulin, which should bring your blood glucose back into the normal range. If you're insulin resistant or have type 2 diabetes, you might have a fasting blood glucose that's elevated. And as we spoke about before, if you have type 1 diabetes and you have a fasting blood glucose that is elevated, it might be an indication that you need more basal insulin to control that overnight blood glucose entering, increasing because of your liver putting on that glucose tap. So most of the time, the fasting blood glucose is actually correlated with the liver, that particular organ. Right. But if we talk about different context, so if your blood glucose is high after a meal, that's an indication that your muscles aren't disposing of the glucose properly. Right. So you want to be able to put that glucose into your muscles, which will bring the blood glucose down into the normal range. If you're insulin resistant at the side of the muscle, you might see a high blood glucose after your meal.
When is the best time to exercise for diabetes management? What time of the day?
Okay, so this is very individualized. So there's a study looking at exactly this. It depends on what mode of exercise you're talking about. There are some issues. Some people have issues if they exercise first thing in the morning in a fasted state, right? With no insulin on board, right? So if you wake up in the morning, which a lot of people who have diabetes tend to be less insulin sensitive first thing in the morning. You've had this overnight sort of natural response where your body pushes glucose out and you're a little bit less sensitive in the morning. And then let's say you go into the gym and you smash either a high intensity resistance training workout, like strength training, or like very high intensity sort of circuit training or HIIT intervals, all that sort of stuff. You might see your blood glucose go up. A lot of people do. And they looked at a study and they showed it was comparing resistance training in people that trained either in the morning in a fasted state with no insulin on board, people, these are type 1 diabetics, compared to people who train in the evening with insulin on board. And obviously they'd eaten meals throughout the day. And they looked at the response over 24 hours and especially overnight. And it seemed to be that the people who trained in the evening, who had insulin on board, who had eaten some meals throughout the day, had better overnight blood glucose control and a better 24-hour average. Whilst people in the morning, it tended to spike them up early, and then they had a hard time staying in range throughout the day and that night. So it depends on the individual. It comes down to self-experimentation. You've got to try these things out for yourself. But generally speaking, I've spoken to a lot of people about this topic. A lot of people have a hard time training high intense workouts in the morning without any insulin on board in a fasted state. That can increase your blood glucose level. So it really depends on the person. And then to make it a little bit more confusing, if it isn't already confusing enough, cardiovascular training or aerobic training has a very different impact on the blood glucose levels. So again, generally speaking, moderate intensity continuous training will reduce your blood glucose levels during the workout and in the time after, whilst very high intensity training can increase your blood glucose. So it really depends. You've got to put in the time and work. But if you're somebody who is having a hard time after a morning workout, try switch it over to the PM, even if it's just after midday, and see if that helps.
This one I think was an important one to raise, considering what we spoke about with the paleo and the keto diet. Now there was 25 participants in this study conducted by Maholt. This was in diabetology. So males 30 to 45 years of age, they consumed a high fat diet. So 65% of their diet was from fats. And this was for 11 days. Okay. And after 5 days of this diet, they then randomly allocated them to an exercise intervention. That intervention was either morning exercise, so 6:30 a.m. in the morning, or 6:30 p.m. in the evening, or sedentary. Now, the participants, if they had any form of cardiovascular disease or diabetes, they were shift workers, whatever it was, they were actually excluded from the study. So this isn't directly relevant to people with diabetes, but definitely relevant in the context of glycemic control and how different times of the day can affect us in terms of when we exercise. So all participants did have a BMI between 27 to 35. What they found was that lower nocturnal blood glucose levels were evident in the group that exercised in the evening. So I guess that presents that risk of nocturnal hypoglycemia if we're exercising in the evening. But we know that with the high fat diet, there's actually that benefit of stabilizing your blood glucose levels. And that's something that you found.
Right. No, this is a great point. So this, again, depends on the individual. So let's say you're somebody who has a very hard time controlling your overnight blood glucose. Like you always have high blood glucose levels overnight. You wake up at the high fasting blood glucose. You might benefit from evening training. You'll have better control overnight. But if you're someone who is at risk of going low overnight, you're always going low, evening training might be an issue for you. That's when you might want to switch to AM training. So again, diabetes is so individualized. It's different in everybody. You've got to know you and your response to different types of exercise. But I think that's a really important point, because I think that study you mentioned is not even in people with diabetes, but it just shows how similar our physiology can be in certain ways. Like whether you have diabetes or not, a lot of these principles apply to everybody. So I would say, get to know your trends and patterns. If you identify with your diabetes educator or your endocrinologist that overnights are a problem for you, you're high more than often, then yes, PM resistance training or cardio training might be a good solution to help you bring that nocturnal high blood glucose level back down into the normal range.